Understanding bezel inserts on watches, specifically their materials, how they've been used, how they have been seen, how they have evolved over time. It's a great subject. A question was asked of me about my opinion on two very common materials we see today used on bezels, and the thinking was to focus not only on them and a comparison looking at their positives and negatives, but looking at the spectrum of the most common bezels that we see, weigh up what makes them great for us as enthusiasts, as vintage collectors, modern owners. So the question from Nick: would love to see a video discussing your thoughts on ceramic versus aluminium bezel inserts. I personally prefer the look of aluminium, but many seem to be clamoring for ceramic these days. Do you think there is something inherent about the look of an aluminium bezel that says or does things that ceramic doesn't, or vice versa? A portion of this video will specify these two materials and their pros and cons, but the reality is that there is no perfect material for a bezel. Realistically, if you're wanting to tick all the boxes when it comes to beautification, function, purpose, form, there's always going to be a negative surrounding the material itself. So let's start with the outlier, the material that has become a relic in itself, that is Bakelite. It is a fantastic material, known as the world's first synthetic plastic. Made a name for itself and was invented at the turn of the 20th century. It found its footing and its real application and purpose between the 20s and the 30s, when mass production became hugely successful. And as a material itself, it has so many properties that makes it very appealing. The main reason why it worked and why it was so applicable for many uses was because it was chemically inert, had great heat resistance, could be thermoformed to any shape, so that's why we see it very commonly with products like telephones, radios. But when we turn our attention to watches, the one piece that comes up more often than not is the 6542 reference GMT Master Rolex. The question we have to ask is, why was this material used for the bezels that we saw back then? And I think there are a few answers. The main feature, which I find incredible, is how resistant it is to external factors. You notice that even today, a lot of these bezels still look brand spanking new. They haven't been affected by ultraviolet light, and I'm sure that was a very appealing factor back then. The process of creating Bakelite is a lengthy one, but creating these bezels must have been even worse. I think the core reason why this was used was because it could be used as a laminate over radium paint, which was very appealing, especially for these GMT Masters. But as most of us know, Bakelite is a very brittle substance, and that is purely down to how the compound is formed. As years go by, the material decomposes, and I'm sure the interaction with radium also affects it. But the finish itself, the finish that Bakelite has, is unlike any material. Glossy, it does look like plastic, but this glossy tone over the top of it makes it look brand new. And again, it blows me away that the condition of many of these looks so intact, that sunlight, UVA, UVB rays haven't affected the finish at all. So the next material we can jump to is aluminium, which is one of the most famous, I would say, when it comes to bezel inserts, one of the most long-lasting, long-used materials in the sports watch category. So the switching from Bakelite to aluminium is understandable. When you look at it from a price perspective, there is a huge divide between these two. Aluminium is more accessible, it's harder wearing, it is much cheaper to manufacture. The process simply requires paint and printing, and it's done. The finish that we see on these bezels are matte, which is also very appealing, especially when you're using these watches in different lighting conditions. You don't necessarily want a highly reflective, glossy surface when you're in dim light, or when you're in the water when the sun might refract off the bezel in a different way. Now, aluminium does have its disadvantages. Where Bakelite is very brittle and can break, can crack, aluminium is very soft, so it scratches very easily. You can dent this material by just looking at it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. When we get to comparing ceramic and aluminium, you'll see what I mean. There is a good reason why this material has been so successful for such a long time. But then we transition to the modern approach, the ceramic bezel insert. It's now widely used everywhere and has essentially replaced aluminium as the most common insert that we see on watches today. We find that more often than not, aluminium is being phased out in favor of this, and the only time we get to see aluminium on watches now is mainly when we look at reissues. Ceramic has the opportunity to show off many different finishes. It can be polished, it can be matte. The process of manufacturing requires heating and glazing, but the technology that can go into these now is quite astounding. Ceramic as a material is brilliant. Of course, there are varying levels to how ceramic is used, but in the sense of watches, it is very high on the Vickers scale. The downside to ceramic as a material is that it is brittle. in a sense that if it does get damaged, it will crack. It is scratch proof, it is corrosion proof. The main marketing scheme is that it is UV resistant, something that aluminium bezels are not. With the basics of these two materials out of the way, let's get to comparing them both and discussing the positives and negatives of aluminium and ceramic. Question we have to ask first is, why was aluminium used? The answer is simple. It is cheap. It is replaceable, easily replaceable. When we think of the context of the professional diver, the professional racing driver, these were used as instruments, as tools for their application. And I'm sure through experience, the manufacturers realized that these components were going to get damaged. They were made to get damaged. We find very often that on these bezels we see the essential details that are quite important for the function of the watch. So for the sake of a chronograph, you have the tachymeter scale. On a dive watch, it's the bezel. If you're using a watch for its intended purpose, it's important that the bezel is clear enough to function. So if it does suffer damage, it needs to be easily disposable and replaceable. And that's why I believe that these lasted so long. These inserts weren't made with the intention of being long-lasting. They were actually made to be replaced easily. So we transition to ceramic and look at what they now offer. The science and the technology behind these are great, and it's now bridged the gap, and it's become so good that it doesn't need to be replaced as often. The whole concept of obsolescence around the bezel is now a thing of the past. So you're getting a watch that is more of a complete package in that sense, where everything is going to last relatively the same extent of time. And if we are talking purely from an industry standard, the process of further developing and further improving a product, this is the way to do it. There is no question about it. The downside is that if this bezel does get damaged, it's going to be more expensive to replace. And then when we start talking about the collector atmosphere, here is when things become a bit murky. One of the most sought after signs of age on a bezel is ghosting, when the bezel actually fades over time, loses its color, mainly due to environmental features like UV rays, like salt water. The way these bezels fade is beyond our control, and you find some of the most amazing colors come from it. Everything from blues to purples to browns, of course different shades of grey. We also find that, like the bezels, the dials also change color, which is what we call tropicalized. And really the faded bezel adds more character, adds more wabi-sabi to the piece, and shows its age, which I think is quite important, especially when you're dealing with vintage watches. So in 50 years' time, when we're looking at the ceramic bezel watch, will it have the same appeal? Because the science tells you that they are now UV resistant, they are scratch proof, corrosion proof. So you end up having a very scratched up stainless steel watch with a bezel and dial that looks immaculate. It's going to be quite a juxtaposition, I think. But then again, we can't be 100% certain. Even though the science tells us that these won't degrade, elements beyond our control could easily affect the structure of this material. We might find over time, for example, that these bezels take on the same kind of visual effect that we find with Reiku pottery, what most of us call spidering on the dial of a watch. We might see the same effect on the bezels. I'm guessing what I'm trying to say is that with the inherent improvement of this material being used on a bezel, it does also detract from the age of the watch, and you won't be able to identify it so much for its age. If we're speaking purely about how these materials present themselves, the aluminium finish, the flat matte finish, I find is a lot more appealing than the polished surfaces or the glossy surfaces that we see on the ceramics. I might catch some flack for this, but a ceramic bezel that is overly polished and shiny does look less like an instrument and more like a toy to my eyes. The matte finished bezel feels like there's more intention and purpose behind its presentation. And there is an interesting point to be made about whether these polished glossy bezels are there purely to attract attention. Is there any real purpose behind the idea of a gloss glazed surface? I don't think there is. It's mainly for looks, and I'm sure it might also play into the treatment and the coating they use to keep this material so resistant. Then to one of my favorite bezel inserts, which is not very common, not very popular, and that is the Sapphire Cap. I like this approach because it does mirror the finish that we would expect to see from a Bakelite insert. I also believe it to be one of the most dynamic looking inserts, where it plays in the light very nicely, where it doesn't actually have a flat finish, but it is domed. After making my commentary on the glossiness of a ceramic bezel, I feel that the Sapphire Cap has a much more professional looking finish to it on the surface. Now, the process of making this and why it is such an excellent material is that it lets you laminate material underneath it. So in the case of dive watches and GMTs, you can actually have the luminova set underneath, as opposed to ceramic bezels where the paint would be set on top, which makes it very easy to be scratched off. With a cap over the top of the luminova, it's going to last for a very long time. Now sapphire, just like the crystals themselves, made in a lab. They are expensive to make. Crystal itself can shatter, it can crack, it can chip. I think the domed nature of the bezel allows it to be more chip resistant, but if the watch does fall from a height and you smash the crystal on the dial, odds are you might smash the bezel too. Still, I think the bonus points that the sapphire capped bezel gets is that it is one of the prettiest. So a lot of what has been discussed is technology that is fairly old school, considering where we are now. Sapphire crystal has been used for a very long time. Ceramic, since the dawn of man. Aluminium, also been used for a very long time. But we move even further ahead into the modern space and we start seeing approaches like the use of forged carbon for bezels. The reason why this is not getting a spotlight is it's not exactly commonly used yet. But if we are talking again purely from a technology and material development approach, this is one of the best. Though the downside is that the finish is either a love it or hate it thing. We haven't touched on materials like titanium, but the beauty of forged carbon is it's a composite that is extremely strong, extremely light, and can pretty much stand up to any conditions. And that is what you want out of a watch. We see them most commonly on pieces like the Audemars Piguet offshore. I think Hublot uses them as well. Zenith are starting to incorporate it into their Defy range. Micro brands are doing the same. But why this isn't getting a big spotlight is because it seems like this material is used entirely through the watch. Not just on the bezel, but the case as well, which I think is quite understandable judging by the nature of the material itself. It does deserve to be used everywhere. This can be a story for another time when we start investigating composite materials. So you might have noticed that I have left one of the materials out, one of the most basic, and I like to think the best for last, and that is stainless steel. The raw material of the watch itself being used as the bezel offers a lot of opportunity. Offers a lot for us who are the enthusiasts, who are the collectors, but also just from a sense of purity standpoint. We notice that cases of watches have very dynamic forms to them. They can either be geometric, they can be organic, they have flow, they have dimension to them. A lot of the time, the use of these multicolored inserts breaks up the image of the watch. What the steel bezel does is complement the material of the watch itself. So what is it that I appreciate about this material being used on a sports watch? It is that it can be shaped and formed to make beautiful surfaces. There are no better examples out there than the AP Royal Oak, the Patek Nautilus. The idea of brushing and polishing, beveling the edges, simple adjustments that complements the form of the watch itself. You think of the process of engine turning, the process of fluted bezels. It's less manufactured and feels more like artistry. Of course, I'm only talking about the finishing of these materials. If we're going to be talking about durability, then we can't exactly pinpoint materials like gold, like platinum, because they are very soft and they can easily be damaged. In the case of steel as a bezel, it is extremely durable, it is shatterproof, it can be replaced very easily and of course mass manufactured. But then if we are speaking about the wabi-sabi and the collector appeal, these bezels will show the same scars that the watches themselves do. You'll see the age and the finishing on the cases everywhere else, and it will be matched with the bezel. There's also this feeling of purity around the steel bezel that I greatly appreciate. There are many factors, positives and negatives about all of these materials and where they work. Is there one material that is better than all of them? And I don't think there really is. We arrive at a crossroads where we start looking at the furtherment of technology and how durable a material can be. But what we sacrifice is the presentation of the age of the watch. We sacrifice a lot of the watch's character purely for it to be longer lasting. If given the choice to wear a watch for all applications, I would say the ceramic bezel is probably the best option that you have today. Purely from an affordability, replaceability, functionality aspect. It will serve you well for the rest of its life, but it won't necessarily age with the watch. But this was a fun exercise, and thank you again, Nick, for the question, looking into the pros and cons of these wonderful materials.